Welcome to Inspired Change, a new inspirational and motivational broadcast that strives to empower men in a positive way, designed to educate, empower, and inspire even the busiest individual on the go over that first cup of coffee. Please join me in welcoming Gunter, international psychologist, author, speaker, and producer.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspired Change. I want to especially warmly welcome those of you who have subscribed to the podcast over the period of time, and I hope you found it inspirational, educational, and some food for the soul. Those of you who are new, I hope you're going to stay with me, and we've got some exciting programs coming up. Every now and then we do a sort of a panel show, and we also do the weekly 20 minutes of my current thinking and some of the stuff that influences me on a day-to-day basis. Now, obviously, a large focus of my work is with boys and men. And so much of the podcasts I'm actually directing at the audience of men and hopefully some boys. You know, I work with some pretty spectacular teenagers who show a great deal of sensitivity and a desire, an aspiration to grow as human beings into fine men. And I also deal a lot with boys who've yet got to find their way and have been unduly influenced by social norms and, you know, male culture that some people choose to describe as toxic. I choose to describe patriarchy as toxic. And I'll explain this as we go along because I want to elaborate on what I meant by last podcast's title, which was Patriarchy, the Maker of Bad Barrels. Now, as I may have talked about before, let me put it more succinctly, I have talked about before about the Stanford prison experiment, an experiment that was conducted in 1971 in North America in the summer by Philip Zimbardo, a highly distinguished and you know, in my book, psychological genius in a sense, about insights into not just the individual mind but the collective mind. And this has especially come through with the Stanford prison experiment, which was about 24 white middle-class college students, basically. So your run-of-the-mill guys who on screening did not exhibit any mental health issues. Okay, so we could probably chuck them in the basket of pretty, you know, generally well-adjusted guys. Now, Zimbardo did something very, very clever. He set up a structure wherein he was simulating a prison. And so he set up some of the students as guards and some of the students as prisoners. And you'd think that the ethics committee would have maybe flagged some issues with that, but they didn't. In fact, the thing that they were most concerned with was that the prison experiment was being conducted in the basement of the psychology department, and they were concerned about fire exits because it was in the basement. How do you get out? So they'd converted the basement into some, prison cells. The janitor's cupboard was basically the hole, which was like a solitary confinement thing. And then they essentially gave the guards free hand to manage and control the prisoners. Now, what was astounding was that in a very short period of time, a dynamic emerged that was really quite concerning, and for the participants, both the guards and the prisoners, was highly stressful. And what eventuated was that the guards in particular started to behave according to their role. And that was that they became more dominating and controlling of the prisoners, and the prisoners became more resistant to being dominated and controlled. So the situation was one which, obviously was leading to a bit of a, storm, and probably, a very potent storm. Now, why am I talking about this prison experiment? How's that relevant? Well, it took Philip Zimbardo a lot of time to process what his role was in the prison experiment and why they had to terminate this experiment, because it was really becoming essentially toxic for everybody concerned, including Philip Zimbardo. And Philip's main takeout of the experiment ultimately, launched him into writing a book called The Lucifer Effect. In other words, why do good people end up doing bad things? And for me, as a young student in psychology, that was also a burning question, because I'd been exposed, to quite a lot of stuff that wasn't terribly, terribly bad, but really raised some questions in my mind about how we interrelate. For a start, I come from a culture and a background historically that started the Second World War. I mean, my background's Austrian. I'm Viennese by birth, and when I was a young boy in an Anglo-Saxon culture, one of the main exposures that I had was about Krauts and how bad we were. If anyone wanted to bully me, that was probably a good starting point. And, I didn't really have the resources as a 12, 13-year-old to really deal with that effectively. But I knew that, people, in Germany and in Austria were involved in doing some horrendous things. And, both at school but also at home, I was constantly being reminded that this was bad. We cannot let ourselves be taken down that road. And so as I got older, I was really interested in the whole issue about human relationships and trying to get an understanding of it. In my adolescence, we had the Vietnam War, we had the issues of apartheid, the racial segregation and anti-discrimination fights, literally globally. But there was also the uprising of women wanting equality within the community, and I was always puzzled with that, particularly because I thought, well, I can understand that some people may be misguided and see, coloured people from a different religion as something separate and scary, perhaps. But I didn't quite understand this issue with the gender problem. Okay, so men having difficulties with women and that women weren't equal. I would often hear comments from men about that were derogatory to women and sexist. And growing up with a very strong mother, that didn't sit well with me, because she inculcated a very strong sense of respect for women and human beings in particular. So there was absolutely no get out of jail card if I was disrespectful and if I didn't cooperate with her, and if I didn't see her in a light that showed that I did love and respect her for who she was, and that being a woman had absolutely no bearing on what she could or couldn't do. So that was really important to me. Now, one of the things that I remember sitting through the Stanford Prison Experiment sort of video was that I'm watching something where essentially people who in their day-to-day life were actually okay, but now in this different setting, they were doing some really shitty things to other people. And those other people were also plotting, some shitty things as sort of a point of revenge or retribution. Now, coming back to the outtakes for Zimbardo from the experiment, was that he devised this very important framework where he talks about bad apples, bad barrels, and bad barrel makers. And when I started my work in examining from a male perspective what patriarchy really is about, and I say that very distinctly because in many ways feminism has a particular socio-political view of patriarchy, whereas as a psychologist, I come into it looking at, well, what's the psyche in this? What is it that's going on at an individual male level? Okay, but the other thing that I realised was that on our own, most men are actually okay. Where we go astray is the moment you start putting us into groups and certain situations. For instance, one of my early experiences where I went, whoa, this is really dodgy, was when I was invited to a bachelor party, and some of the guys may go, oh, what's wrong with that? Well, the bachelor party wasn't the problem. What happened was we ended up in a strip club where most of the guys by this stage were pretty drunk, and the way that a lot of the guys in this bachelor party were treating this particular woman, the stripper, was absolutely appalling. And a friend of mine and I actually pulled the pin on it and left early. Now, one of the things that resulted in was us getting a bit of an earful from the rest of the guys about what's wrong with us. And in fact, one of the guys on his own towards me said, "What are you, gay?" And I went, "No, but I just don't appreciate and I won't condone or stand by a woman being basically maligned like that and abused, because it was abusive." And so as I'm going along, I'm going, what's the dynamic here? Where are the links? And as I said, for me, it wasn't about toxic masculinity. What eventually became very clear was that we have a system, a maker of bad barrels, right, that allows or facilitates or triggers men, or potentially triggers men into some really bad behaviour when we're in a group. But we also have a political system, economically, that operates at that level, right? And I talk about, the essentially, the masculine culture of old versus new. So the patriarchal culture tends to be territorial, hierarchical, acquisitional, and competitive. And what we're working towards is a new masculinity, a new masculine culture that's inclusive, it's democratic, it's distributive, and it's cooperative. Okay, but we're in a transition period. I'm always heartened to see lots of men stand up. And this is why in Making Good Men Great, I focus on the link between individual evolution and social, cultural evolution. And we're in a state of flux at the moment. We're seeing a huge backlash towards the evolutionary process. So, I come back to this idea is that firstly, we as men need to understand the history and culture of patriarchy in order to take it apart and keep what's going to help us into a new consciousness, a new spirit, a new soul of being a man, of being male. And that is the thing that I'm really talking about when I talk about we live in a system of makers of bad barrels. It's evident in politics, it's evident in education, where, the moment groups of boys gather together who are, obviously running hard on hormones, but without the modelling and without the influence of establishing good, strong, powerful values that the boys are mentored with, they're going to play up, they're going to act out. It's a bit like Lord of the Flies. If you haven't seen that movie, you need to watch it. Okay, it is a very important piece of work that, tends to cut into the dynamics of collective male psyche in a patriarchal framework. Okay, and that's the key thing. So one of the things that, I'm very strong about is that as men, I can't speak for women, but I can speak for men. And so, I need to examine my inner motivations. What is it that I'm doing? And part of that is that growth for me as a male about being emotionally literate, It's about being empathic and growing in my capacity of